Coming up next on the AI Policy Podcast, we will be talking about the state of autonomous weapons in Ukraine, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the Chevron Doctrine and its implications on AI regulation, the delayed deployment of Apple Intelligence in the EU, and Nvidia's deal to send its technology to data centers in the Middle East. We are back with the AI Policy Podcast. I am Brielle Hill, the Associate Director for the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies, here with my boss and co-host, Gregory C. Allen, Director of the Wadhwani Center. Let's kick off today's discussion with the state of autonomous weapons in Ukraine. Greg, an article came out July 2nd in the New York Times called AI Begins Ushering in an Age of Killer Robots. What did you make of this article?
So this article is genuinely good. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of reporting that is not what you're going to find elsewhere. The New York Times reporters who did this piece, Paul Mosier and Adam Satariano, got access to a lot of interesting folks in Ukraine, the companies that are making the most advanced drones and AI and autonomous systems. And there's just some interesting developments in there that we're going to talk about here that people should go and read the original piece for. But before we have to go into that, I have to give my sort of, at this point, it's going to sound like petty grievances about all reporting on AI and autonomous weapons, which is a real failure to understand what is new and interesting and based on progress in AI and what is not, right? So the piece opens by talking about how there is a quadcopter that is following this individual on a motorcycle, and it's a training exercise, so nobody's going to die. But the drone is able to use computer vision to lock onto the person on the motorcycle. And if it had explosives, it would have been able to do it. Would have been able to kill this person if they had the operator had activated the explosives. Well, this is described as an autonomous weapon, and it's just not. It's not, and it's not also a revolution in warfare in any meaningful way. What do I mean by that? Well, the first air-to-air heat-seeking missiles, right? The one that can lock on to the heat generated by an aircraft's engine and then fire a missile that tracks that heat and blows up that with no remote pilot operating that missile. Yeah, the United States introduced that in 1949.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so 75 years ago is how old this technology is. So what is interesting and new here is not that there is autonomous tracking. Autonomous tracking has been around for ages, right? What's interesting and new here, and the article does emphasize this aspect of it, just not to the degree of precision that I would like. What is new here is that autonomous tracking and precision is now cheap and widely available.
Gotcha.
So the types of systems that the United States military has done this with routinely cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. What this system costs is maybe $1,000. And it's using widely available machine learning AI algorithms that are just available off the shelf. Anybody can go download these algorithms. That's very different from what had to be done in the 50s, where you got a bunch of genius physicists and early programmers, to write the equations that would actually drive all of that in a custom, handcrafted kind of a way. So on the one hand, there's some stuff that's new here, which is about access, availability, proliferation of these capabilities. But in terms of whether or not it's a new era of warfare, not really. This is the same era of warfare we've been in for a long time. It's just that we're seeing it on new parts of the battlefield, in new contexts of the battlefield. So that's sort of what I found frustrating about the piece.
So you very clearly want to have some more precision around the use of the term autonomy. Let's take a step back. What defines an autonomous weapon?
This is an area that folks who've listened to the podcast will know is a common source of frustration for me, because there's a difference between an autonomous system and an autonomous weapon system. And here I'm referring to DoD policy, so what the United States Department of Defense classifies as an autonomous weapons system, which is different than what people are using in this article, what people might use in everyday conversation. And so that's why, me as a former DoD policymaker consuming the news oftentimes get frustrated, because there's use of the same terms, but it's not really what those terms mean in a policy context. So think about, for example, the difference between autonomous navigation and autonomous target selection and engagement, right? If you are an Amazon delivery drone, right? Remember the commercials for how these drones are going to pick up the packages, fly them all the way to your house and drop them off at your house and then go back to the warehouse? Hasn't happened for me yet, but maybe someday. That is autonomous navigation, right? That is not autonomous weaponry. That is not autonomous target selection and engagement.
Right.
Then you have to think about the difference between target identification and target selection and engagement, right? So imagine you have a fingerprint scanner, right? And it says, okay, there's this wanted criminal. Here are the fingerprints of this individual. If you ever encounter this individual, arrest them immediately, right? Well, the fingerprint scanner is not selecting the target. The fingerprint scanner is identifying the target, right? A human has selected the target. They have said, it is this person. And now here is a machine that is capable of identifying that person once they encounter them. Well, I just gave you, the fingerprint scanner law enforcement version of that. But now think about it in a warfare context, right? If I say, you are authorized to engage the Russian flagship in the Navy context of the war in Ukraine. Here is what the flagship looks like. Here are the radar emissions it's associated with. Here are the heat signatures it's associated with. You drone, if you ever see this flagship, blow it up.
Right.
Right? What might be used there is target recognition, target identification. Now, what autonomous selection and engagement might mean is, let me just use an example. This is like the canonical example of an autonomous weapon in international legal context, in international legal discussions. It's the Israeli Harpy drone. And what's different about this drone is you're not saying, hey, go attack that warship as soon as you find it. You're saying, hey, just go fly in the air for 9 hours. And if you ever see anything that looks like a bad guy, go ahead and kill it.
Oh.
Right? Because now you're saying it's not about this bad thing that I want you to go destroy. It's like, just go fight in the war. If you see things that are bad, make your own best judgment. So that's the difference between target identification and target selection and engagement. And in order for the United States Department of Defense policy classifying something as an autonomous weapon system, and once you're an autonomous weapon system, a lot of regulation kicks in. Right? There's a lot of restrictions on what it means to develop an autonomous weapon system. There's a lot of restrictions on what it means to use an autonomous weapon system, with some notable exceptions like missile defense and a few other areas. But an autonomous weapon system, and I'm just going to read the definition, a weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by an operator. So what's interesting there is that it excludes heat-seeking missiles. Heat-seeking missiles would not be classified as an autonomous weapon system. That motorcycle that the New York Times article opens up with would not be classified as an autonomous weapon system, which doesn't mean that there aren't autonomous weapon systems. The Patriot missile defense system has a full autonomous weapon system mode. So these things do exist in the U.S. arsenal and in arsenals around the world. But when you talk about what Ukraine is demonstrating that is new, it's not, at least not yet, autonomous weapon systems. What this is new technologies for maintaining target lock, new technologies for tracking targets that have already been selected by human operators. And I think this is very true, and I do think the article does this well, it brings us much closer to a much greater degree of autonomy. So the companies that the New York Times has interviewed and some of the Ukrainian officials make it very clear that, hey, the way we're doing this right now is we still have humans who are operating these systems, at least in terms of selecting and making the decision about whether or not to engage targets. So maybe they're not piloting the drone anymore, but they are still, in a meaningful sense, controlling, operating the drone. That could change, right? It is not that many software upgrades away from being able to do that. It is a conscious choice to make these things not be an autonomous weapons system. And I would say, based on what we're hearing in this story, the quotes that we get from folks like Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, who plays actually a pretty important role in warfare technology right now, he said, quote, "We need maximum automation. These technologies are fundamental to our victory. We will do everything we can to introduce automation to its maximum to save the lives of our soldiers." So what that basically says is, to the extent that Ukraine is not using autonomous weapons right now, that's a decision they're making not because they think that autonomous weapons are unethical inherently, as some nonprofits would have you believe in the advocacy ecosystem. What they're basically saying is this is a performance-based decision. Right now, these things work better when they have a human operator. As soon as they work better when they don't need a human operator, we're going to use them more widely. And I think that kind of makes sense, given the situation that Ukraine is facing. And, the situations in which this is operating matter a lot here. There's a big difference in using, an autonomous weapon in the middle of a deserted field between two trench lines where there are no civilians, and using an autonomous weapon system in a crowded city where there's a lot of civilians around. So the fact that Ukraine is saying that they would be willing to use autonomous weapon systems doesn't mean they would be willing to use them cavalierly in a bunch of contexts where it might not make any kind of sense.
Right.
They're going to come up with a system for how they think that's going to be appropriate. But what they're just saying, I think at this stage, is they're not ruling it out on ethical grounds. They're not ruling it out on legal grounds. And in that regard, they are in the same situation as many dozens of militaries around the world. I mentioned the Patriot missile defense system has a fully autonomous mode.
Right.
There are dozens of countries around the world that have systems that are, under the U.S. definition, an autonomous weapons system. The difference here is that those systems tend to cost many millions of dollars. The operators using them have an awful lot of training. In this context, we see technologies that are not just available to militaries with much smaller budgets, but very plausibly available to terrorists and other types of organizations in the not too distant future. And so that's really, I think, what this article does a pretty good job of talking about where we might be headed in the not too distant future.
Yeah, so you're saying that you can have autonomy built into certain steps of a system, but until the entire system is autonomous, it does not trigger that DoD definition of an autonomous system.
Yeah.
Ukraine at this point is saying that they have some of those capabilities, but they are not using them quite yet. To what extent are the Russian forces using autonomous technologies and or systems in this conflict?
Yeah, this is one thing that I think the article could have done a better job of. On the one hand, I give a lot of credit to the authors of this piece, the reporters who did this work, because they got a lot of access to Ukrainian military companies that I hadn't seen in English language press before. So there's one thing that it's talking about, which is a robotic machine gun that's using computer vision AI to detect targets, to identify where to shoot in order to hit those targets. Again, this is still a human-in-the-loop system. It is this system telling you, if you want to hit that target, here's where you aim, and automatically identifying that target. It is not making the decision to select and engage. So in its current instantiation, it would not be an autonomous weapon system because it's still human-operated. But the quote that I thought was so interesting from the Ukrainian forces was, quote, "We could sit in the trench drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes and shoot at the Russians," which I think is just such a really remarkable different state of affairs, right, from what you normally think of when you think of trench warfare.
Absolutely.
And again, it's only one software update. If they choose to make it autonomous, they could go that route. Then they are right now, making that decision based on really performance. So you asked about the Russians. The thing that really kind of frustrated me is that when they mentioned this gun turret, they didn't mention that there are Russian weapons manufacturers and Russian military organizations who have been talking about developing this technology for 5+ years. I'm trying to even remember the first time I saw the Russians' tests of, in their words, neural network, which is a subcategory of AI-driven machine gun turrets. But these technologies are absolutely being pursued by the Russians just as aggressively. I think the real question is, are they being pursued just as effectively, just as competently? Another thing I would say here is, that was really interesting in this article was the degree to which the innovation is actually coming from the front lines. Not just the companies that have a deep relationship with the soldiers, but in some cases in this reporting, actual soldiers themselves who are personally responsible for developing the technologies, developing prototypes, experimenting with them, making them more widely available to other forces across Ukraine. That's a really interesting story and kind of different from how the DoD org chart tries to make stuff happen. There's communities where that's a little bit more common, especially in the special forces community. But I think the degree to which the people developing and fielding technologies can learn rapidly from what's going on the front lines, that's some really important stuff that the U.S. military needs to take away from what we're seeing in Ukraine, like what's in the reporting in this article.
Right. So the big takeaway from this headline, AI begins ushering in an age of killer robots, is not necessarily that Ukraine is right now deploying fully autonomous weapon systems, that Russia is completely in lockstep with that, and that maybe we should be thinking more about the precise use of autonomy. For my family back at home looking at this article, they're probably gasping at that thought. What would be your biggest takeaways from the first 2 years of this conflict and how AI is shaping warfare moving forward?
So I don't want to diminish what is going on in Ukraine and Russia in its importance at all. It's incredibly important. It's a really advanced source of rapid technological innovation because both sides are under life and death pressure to innovate. And that naturally leads to a rapid innovation cycle. So it's not that Ukraine is not important. It's not that Ukraine is not interesting. It's that what parts of the story are interesting. Capabilities that used to be exquisite and expensive and available only to the few might now be cheap, comparatively simple, and available much, much more widely. And the types of systems that we know of, like precision-guided munitions, smart weapons, well, historically, those have been really expensive. Now they might be cheap and derived largely from commercial technologies. You know, one of the things that really I thought was quite stark in this was, you know, there's a video game console that's very popular called a Steam Deck. So maybe folks who are listening out there have a Steam Deck made by a company called Valve. Well, that video game console, which you can use to play regular video games, is the exact same video game console that Ukrainian operators are using to pilot and operate their weapons systems. And that's just because it has a large, really nice screen. It has controls that lots of 18 to 25-year-olds around the world know how to use. And it's a well-built system that is easily, integratable with custom-built software. So the degree to which these amazing developments in warfare are being driven by commercial technologies, I think is the other big takeaway here.
Okay, so I want to move over to regulations. I, like many folks across the DMV and the nation, had my eyes and ears on decisions coming out of the Supreme Court as they wrapped up the 2023-2024 term. And while we do not frequently discuss SCOTUS decisions on this podcast, we could see some major implications on AI regulation from their most recent rulings. So on June 28th, the Supreme Court issued its decision which overturned the Chevron Doctrine and significantly reduced the power of federal agencies to interpret laws they administer. Can you take us back and talk about what the Chevron Doctrine is and how it's been used up to this point?
Yeah, so the Chevron Doctrine has been a part of the U.S. legal landscape since the mid-1980s. Rather ironically, it was the Reagan administration that was pursuing what ultimately became the Chevron Doctrine because at the time the courts were quite liberal and Reagan, overseeing the executive branch, was quite conservative. So they wanted to take away power from the courts to interpret administrative law and leave that power with the administrative branch, and they succeeded. Well, now the courts are rather conservative and the executive branch is rather liberal, and so you are now seeing conservatives seeking to overturn the Chevron Doctrine, and now they have. So the Chevron Doctrine really deals with specifically a category of regulation around administrative law. And this is a case in which Congress has said that some federal agency is empowered to make regulations on such and such. So I want to give a shout out to Charlie Bullock for his write-up of this issue at the Institute for Law and AI. I thought he did a great job explaining this and its implications for AI, and I'm going to reuse some of his analysis here. One of the cases he talked about was an earlier regulation on small electric motors, right? So Congress said this agency shall be empowered to regulate small electric motors. And now the question is, what is a small electric motor?
Right.
Is it the sort of small electric motor that you would see in a model airplane or like a child's toy? Might weigh 3 to 4 ounces?
Mm-hmm.
Or is a small electric motor like small because it's powering a weed whacker and not a car? So it's small because, it only weighs 20 pounds instead of 200 pounds. Well, the law, as passed by Congress, as signed by the president, did not define small electric motor. So it then falls to the agency implementing that law to say, okay, when we say we're going to regulate small electric motors, we mean anything up to, I'm just making this up, 25 pounds. Well, now a company comes and sues that agency and says, hey, you're only empowered to regulate small electric motors. That should be like kids' toys. And my weed whacker is not a small electric motor. It's a large electric motor. And so your regulations should not apply. Well, under the Chevron Doctrine, as long as the agency had a reasonable interpretation of the law, if the law was vague, then the agency's reasonable interpretation was just valid. The courts did not give themselves the power to say, we know that the agency's interpretation was reasonable. However, we prefer this other interpretation, and so the agencies lose. So it was kind of, in legal debates, a trump card in terms of interpreting the statutes. And anybody who's ever worked in a highly regulated industry knows that interpretation of the law is super, super important. And what the Chevron Doctrine gave was federal agencies a lot of clarity on their own authorities, because as long as they had a reasonable interpretation, they could know that somebody who sued them was going to lose. Well, that's over now. So there are 18,000 court cases in the federal courts that have cited the Chevron Doctrine. And Chief Justice John Roberts has said that it is not necessarily the case that all of these cases are automatically overturned, but they could be overturned. And so every federal agency that has ever sort of said, like, hey, maybe you don't like our interpretation, but the law was vague as passed by Congress, and our interpretation is reasonable, so tough. Our interpretation is the one that's going to stay. Well, now any company can say, actually, we're going to try and say that your interpretation is inferior to one that we would like the courts to decide. And then they can go try and find a judge who will agree with them in terms of what the alternative interpretation of the law is. I want to say that the Chevron Doctrine is so wrapped up in the American legal system that people in Congress have been counting on it when they write their laws. They are more comfortable having a lesser degree of precision because they know they are trusting that the agencies are basically going to catch the ball when Congress tries to pass the ball to those agencies. Well, now the courts are basically saying, sorry, that's no longer valid, and the court system can intervene at any point. And so there's this entire universe of legislation that was written under the assumption that the Chevron Doctrine would be there, and it's not necessarily going to be there anymore. And if you haven't noticed, Congress doesn't pass a lot of laws anymore. So all those old regulations that were counting on Chevron, you might say, oh, it's the normal checks and balances system. All that the courts are really telling is Congress, hey, you got to go back and do more homework. But Congress doesn't work right now. Mm-hmm. So in effect, this is a massive deregulatory step. And I've been talking too much about Chevron in general. We got to talk about Chevron in AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking about how old regulations might be under scrutiny and under question. What we talk a lot about on our team is how congressmen and women are not necessarily technologically equipped to feel comfortable to make AI law and regulations. I'm wondering what you think the implications of this decision is for AI regulation moving forward.
Yeah, and I think it's noteworthy that this actually came up during oral arguments. So Justice Elena Kagan specifically highlighted AI as one of the areas that demands the flexibility provided by Chevron. Her quote is really juicy, so I've just got to read the whole thing. She said, quote, "Congress can hardly see a week into the future with respect to this subject," meaning AI, "let alone a year or a decade." Then she goes on to say that the court does not, quote, "even know what the questions are about AI, let alone the answers," end quote. So she's basically saying that the Chevron Doctrine not only had it right, but that AI is sort of like the perfect case in point, where if you are expecting congressional staffers, members of Congress to sort of write the law today that predicts exactly what types of regulations we're going to wish we had 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, they're like not up to that task. And now there's no way that Congress can sort of delegate that task by characterizing its overall regulatory vision and then delegating the nitty-gritty details of that to the agencies. That's a lot harder to do. And it's also going to be a lot harder for agencies to access their existing authorities for AI. Not in every case, but in a lot of cases.
It also seems to me that she mentions that the courts may also not be well equipped to make rulings on the technical aspects of AI regulation as well. Is that what you're seeing in there too?
Yeah, I mean, she's talking about the limitations of both the congressional branch and the judicial branch, because she's arguing that this is an area in which executive branch flexibility, when delegated by Congress, is appropriate. But that's not the ruling we have, and so that's not the regulatory environment we're going to have. I want to point out that there still are ways for Congress to give flexibility to executive branch agencies. They just have to be a lot more intentional about doing that. So, for example, when in that small electric motor case that I was just talking about a moment ago, Congress wrote the law, saying that they are empowered to regulate small electric motors. They did not define what small electric motors are. But if instead Congress had said, the agency is empowered to regulate electric motors of all sizes and also can give itself discretion for what categories of motors to not regulate, then that flexibility would be preserved, right? But we're moving from an area of reasonableness, which matters a lot in the U.S. legal system, sort of a reasonableness standard, to one where a much, much greater degree of precision is required. And I have a lot of friends who work on the Hill and have worked on the Hill. It's a really hard job, and nobody ever gets it right on the first try, and now everything is just a lot harder.
Yeah, and we're about to see a huge milestone in the Biden administration's executive order coming up. My assumption is that these agencies have been operating under the assumption that the Chevron Doctrine would hold up. Do you think that there's going to be an impact on the Biden administration's executive order and reporting requirements that the EO has charged the agencies to come about with after this decision?
Yeah, I do think there's going to be an impact. Now, what the impact looks like is going to differ on an agency-by-agency basis and on a domain-by-domain basis. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, which is a really important regulator of the technology industry, I don't think this is going to affect them that much. Just as an empirical fact, they go to court all the time. They don't cite Chevron Doctrine that much because a lot less of their work has to deal with administrative law, which is really what's at the heart of the Chevron Doctrine here. But other regulators who are tasked by the executive order to sort of determine what degree of regulation they want to pursue in their given field. Think, for example, the Department of the Treasury, thinking about the use of AI in finance and banking. They're going to have to take a look, right, at what specific authorities they are invoking and whether or not there is a suitable degree of precision in the authorities that Congress has granted them for them to be willing to take on the risk, right? Because you got to understand, as a government bureaucrat, it is no fun to be sued. It is no fun at all to go to court. And so if you're looking at, hey, we could go do this thing, but it kind of relies upon a legal interpretation that we think is solid, but we also know that the industry really hates this idea. And so they're 1,000,000% going to sue us. And so if we pursue this, we're going to have to do all of the work of designing and implementing the regulation. And then we maybe have a 50% chance of being overturned by the courts in 2 years. That's not especially attractive. And so I think one of the really important implications of this overturning is the way it's going to make regulatory agencies much, much more cautious. And so you might see some kind of safety accident or some kind of rights violation, and then a call in the public media, in the public discourse for some kind of regulatory response. And then the agencies are going to say, I don't really know if I want to take that on unless and until Congress acts. And Congress has been paralyzed in a big way for a long time. So Congress is probably not going to act. So I think the path to substantive AI regulation in a lot of different segments of the economy, it hasn't gone away. There's still stuff that is already happening that is important, is going to continue to remain important. But it has narrowed. The path has narrowed, unquestionably.
So we've been talking about future regulation here in the U.S. Let's talk about current regulation over in the EU. On June 21st, Apple announced it would delay the deployment of Apple Intelligence in the EU due to, quote, regulatory uncertainties, which I sort of chuckled at because we talk about that with the EU quite frequently. But what are these regulatory uncertainties referring to in this context?
So I think what's first and foremost kind of interesting is that we've been talking about the EU AI Act a lot on this podcast. It's a really big, important part of AI policy around the world. But the EU already had some big laws in effect that have been affecting the AI sector. Folks will remember when Italy briefly banned ChatGPT. That was under their authorities under GDPR, the big EU privacy law. It was not the EU AI Act. This Apple case did not relate to the EU AI Act. It actually related to the Digital Markets Act, which is the EU's sort of signature law around fair competition in digital technologies. Well, Apple, because of the power of the iPhone, and especially, at least in this case, the iPhone App Store, is one of the targets of this Digital Markets Act. They are treated as, quote unquote, a gatekeeper of the overall digital market because they basically say, here's who gets to play on the App Store. Here's who gets to, be a part of that market. So Apple is basically saying that they're looking at their future AI services, which they announced at a big conference not that many weeks ago. We talked about it here on this podcast. They're really excited about what they're going to do with AI for their user communities. And they basically said that the way the DMA applies is unclear to us in this case. And the regulators have not provided enough clarity that they are facing the exact same sort of decision that I was talking about regulators facing in the US context, right, under the Chevron Doctrine. Basically, Apple is sort of saying, okay, do we want to spend all the time, money, and effort to launch these products in the EU only to be told by the European Commission that, in fact, everything we've been doing is illegal? And so they are not saying that they're not going to launch those features in the European market. They are saying that they are not going to launch those features unless and until they have legal clarity around what they are able to do, what they are not able to do under this regulation. I think one thing that's kind of in the back of my mind as I think about this is how much of this, this sends a pretty strong signal from the tech industry to the European Union. The European Union has sort of been saying, hey, we want regulation to protect our consumers, to ensure fair competition. We're not anti-innovation. We are just pro-fair competition, which itself should support innovation. Well, Apple is not the first big AI company to talk about delaying the rollout of features in the European market because of regulatory concerns. Meta recently did the exact same thing with their latest and greatest version of the Llama large language model system. They said, they're going to delay the launch of it until they can figure out how to comply or whether they can even comply with EU regulation. Well, that's a pretty loud signal that they're trying to send to European regulators, where they're saying, hey, you thought you could do all this regulation and not have some really negative consequences in terms of Europe's technology adoption rate? No, you are going to be left behind. Right now it's by months, but who knows, in the future it could be by years. And so in the back of my mind is I know that the tech industry wants to send that signal. They've been saying that message for years now. But this is the first time they're sort of saying, okay, we're delaying the launch of products. So how much of that is because they actually are trying to have their lawyers figure out what's allowed, what's not allowed? And how much of that is just because they want the European Commission to know that they mean it, that they're serious this time when they say that the regulations are getting too intense and that there's going to be a cost? I don't really know. It's just something that's in the back of my mind as I see these types of actions coming out.
Right. And as this is the AI policy podcast, what makes this Apple delaying technology story an AI story?
So the Digital Markets Act, one of the things that it was really thinking about in its original regulatory framework was app stores. And that's because the iPhone, iOS operating system, that's a platform that other companies build upon, right? Apple builds the App Store. Other companies build, market, and make money off the apps that are sold in that app store. Well, artificial intelligence is looking like the new platform of the 21st century. And so a lot of companies are going to want to figure out a way to integrate with and make money off of what Apple is doing with AI, this Apple Intelligence stuff that they have announced previously. Well, Apple prides itself on protecting user privacy and protecting the integrity of user data, but some of that data is really important to enabling fair competition. Just to give you one example, one of the things that makes Facebook data so valuable is the social network, right? You are declaring by who you follow on Instagram or who you friend on Facebook or who you connect with on LinkedIn and all of these social networks, you're sort of saying these are people who I have an existing relationship with. Well, that's really valuable information to marketers. It's also really valuable information to that social network's competitors. When Instagram originally launched, one of the things that they did is you could import your contacts from your email or from Twitter. So you could automatically try and find everybody on Instagram who you already follow on Twitter. So that social graph data was super valuable to Instagram because the value of the network goes up the more people are on it. If they're making it easy to copy paste the social network from some other platform, that's really useful. Twitter eventually shut that down because they're like, oh my gosh, we're giving away the golden goose. Well, my point is, right, that's quote unquote personal data, right? Who are all your friends that the European Union might want to protect from a privacy perspective. But if they want to enable competition, if they want a European company to compete with Meta, to compete with X, to compete with LinkedIn, well, then it would be really helpful if you could export that data. It would be really helpful if it was mandatory that you could give away that data. And so the point here is that the EU is forcing these interoperability requirements, thinking about how they can make more competition available, more competition possible. But that then comes against privacy concerns, right? How would you change your approach to your current social networks if the government was forcing you to give away all of your contact information or other types of information? It might just sort of change how you think about that. So as Apple is thinking about this sort of next platform of AI, where the types of data that you give your AI might be just as, perhaps even more personal than the types of data you give your search engine, right, about what's going on in your life. If you really want to know what type of medical problems people are currently wrestling with, go look at their Google search history.
Right.
I bet you it's all over there. And think about, what types of conversations they're going to have with an AI in the exact same vein. And so this is a case where Apple, the European regulators are all wrestling with these incredibly thorny issues. And I think the tech companies are on the one hand, genuinely concerned about the impact of this regulation on them and their business. The penalty for non-compliance can be as much as 10% of global annual turnover, which is roughly equivalent to 10% of global revenue. That kind of fine is going to hurt, right? So they're really concerned about violating these laws. At the same time, I do think they want to send a signal to regulators that they're not happy about the direction all this is headed.
Yeah, sure. So when we're analyzing all these different types of regulation, we talk about how they interact with each other. So how does the DMA align or differ from the EU AI Act?
So the Digital Markets Act, as I said before, is primarily competitive fairness type law, vaguely analogous to antitrust type stuff that we would do here in the United States. There's also the Digital Services Act, which goes into a little bit more about like what types of things can take place under what conditions when you're delivering digital services. I know that some regulation of deepfakes and dissemination, is going to be very possibly coming down the pike through the DMA and the DSA. So that's a key AI concern that might actually get regulated even before the EU AI Act and the AI office that is set up to enforce it comes down the pike. The actual here's what's covered here, here's what's covered there, I think it's probably too in the weeds for this podcast, but does sound like a great idea for a paper for our team to write at some point.
All right. So what are you going to be watching for as this plays out between Apple and the DMA?
Well, I think one thing that I want to pay attention to is the movements by the European Commission. And the European Commissioner for Competition, Margrethe Vestager, said following Apple's decision on Apple Intelligence and the DMA, she said, quote, "I find it very interesting that they say we will now deploy AI only where we are not obliged to enable competition. I think that this is the most stunning open declaration that they know 100% that this is another way of disabling competition where they have a stronghold already," end quote. So she's basically saying that Apple is doing this entirely as a signaling thing. Apple is hoping that their customers get mad and go complain to the European Commission, and that Apple is being completely insincere. So what the European Commission does in response here, I think, is sort of the logical next move. Apple has made its move. Is the EU Commission going to make some kind of counter move would be my next question.
Okay, well, shifting over to the Middle East, we're going to move on to AI and geopolitics. On June 19th, Nvidia signed a deal with Ooredoo, a Qatari telecoms group, to deploy its technology to data centers in 5 Middle East countries. Can you give an overview of what the nature of this deal is?
Yeah, so Ooredoo is becoming an Nvidia cloud partner. So Nvidia is going to sell the chips that go in the servers, that go in the data center, that power the cloud capabilities. Ooredoo is going to be the cloud provider who then sells to other companies across the Middle East. And so Nvidia is going to sell its graphics processing units. Those are the key chips that power AI algorithms at 26 data centers owned by Ooredoo. And it's not just in Qatar, the company's home base. It's also in Algeria, Tunisia, Oman, Kuwait, and the Maldives. So this is kind of a big move. And the company said that they're going to get Nvidia's best chips and that they're going to deliver machine learning and AI capabilities to all of their various customers. I think it's interesting in a few ways. Number one, folks who listen to this podcast will remember that there was a big hubbub a few months ago about a deal between a UAE company, G42, and Microsoft for bringing AI capabilities to the UAE. And it was reported that there was also a deal between the United States government and the UAE in order to allow for this. And G42 very publicly said that they had a lot of ties to the Chinese technology ecosystem, and they were cutting those ties in order to make this kind of deal possible. In the case of this Ooredoo Nvidia deal with Qatar, there's none of that kind of reporting. There's no super secret deal that's going on between the various governments, or at least no reporting on that topic. The U.S. government was definitely involved because they had to approve the licenses to sell these chips. The most advanced NVIDIA chips require an export license, but Qatar is on the list of countries that can receive those chips where the license application is reviewed with a presumption of approval. So basically, the question then becomes, like, is Qatar a likely pass-through point for these chips to find their way to Chinese soil or Chinese companies? And it appears to be the case that the U.S. made the conclusion that no, that this is not any kind of interesting security risk, and that this is just a U.S. company succeeding in global markets.
So does Ooredoo have any links to China?
There's some, in terms of at least of what's available in public. For example, in May 2023, last year, Ooredoo announced a 5-year extension to its partnership with the Chinese telecommunications company ZTE, which for a long time has been the number 2 Chinese telecommunications company behind Huawei, and was very famously the subject of export controls in the past. But Ooredoo's deal with ZTE was about lithium batteries, not about AI or cloud. So perhaps there are more links than are just available in public reporting. But, based on what's available in public reporting, I kind of understand why the U.S. government decided that this was not a likely pass-through risk to China.
So what has been the U.S.'s approach to selling chips to the Middle East?
So I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago, the answer would have been the more the better, the faster the better. It's great when American companies succeed in global markets. The war in Ukraine has led everybody to sort of be horrified, right, when they see Western technology and chips being used in Russian weapons systems. And the Middle East has, in the past, been a transit point for chips finding their way to Russia or to other sanctioned entities. So all of that is, of course, on people's mind, on people's radar. And then the Chinese connection really comes in because we're talking about these Nvidia AI chips, which are not, the dinky $1 chips that go in your drone or go in your car to control like the windshield wipers. These are like $40,000 beefy AI processing chips. And that is really what the Chinese export controls have historically been thinking about. So in May 2024, Bloomberg reported that U.S. officials have been slowing the issuing of licenses for Nvidia and AMD, the 2 big providers of GPUs in the United States, for large-scale AI accelerator shipments to the Middle East. And that just says slowing the issuing of licenses. And so to me, what that says is that, hey, these are still being reviewed with a presumption of approval, which is the sort of important regulatory language, presumption of approval. However, we're not going to just rubber stamp these anymore. We are actually going to try and do some degree of due diligence to try and figure out whether or not there's a export controls evasion risk here.
So is there anything else that our listeners should know about what's going on with the AI data center chips competition?
Yeah, I think there's one really interesting move coming out of China recently. So on June 28th, China's Alibaba Cloud unit announced that it plans to shut down data centers in India and Australia later this year. That's really interesting. So the big Western cloud giants, Google, Amazon AWS, and Microsoft Azure, they have dominant market share around the world with a really big important exception, China, where the cloud business is dominated by Alibaba Cloud. And there's been a handful of countries where Alibaba Cloud has really fought hard to make inroads abroad, outside of China. And that includes India. Well, by saying that they're pulling out of India, they're kind of throwing in the towel and basically saying that they don't want to compete against the US Big Three as well as the local Indian companies who are serving cloud in those markets. They're saying they want to focus on other areas. And the named areas, at least that Alibaba is discussing publicly, were Southeast Asia and Mexico. Well, what's going on in Southeast Asia and Mexico? In Mexico, there's a big push by Chinese manufacturing firms to relocate out of China into Mexico as a tariff avoidance strategy, because the tariffs apply based on where the products are made and where the products are shipped from. So if they are made in Mexico, not made in China, even if they're made by Chinese companies, tariffs no longer apply because you have the US, Mexico, Canada free trade agreement, the thing that used to be NAFTA. Well, a lot of Chinese companies are now setting up big operations in Mexico, and the cloud provider, Alibaba, is hoping it can follow its Chinese customers to these international expansion in Mexico. And I think a very similar story is going on in Southeast Asia. So Alibaba is basically saying that they don't really want to go head-to-head with Amazon, AWS, Microsoft, Google when they're competing for like Unilever contracts or Procter & Gamble contracts in Italy. They really think that they're dominant in China. They want to follow those Chinese companies that are going global. And I think that's really interesting. We don't really know how much of this story yet is going to be AI, but most data centers and most cloud giants around the world are, of course, if they're doing anything, they're thinking about what AI features in that future. And so you might see some big Alibaba AI cloud computing centers in the not too distant future.
Well, we are going to continue to follow that ongoing chip war and certainly bring any updates back to this podcast. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you, Brielle.
If you have any feedback, please drop us a line at the AI Policy Podcast at csis.org. We like to hear how you're utilizing this podcast, and if you feel so inclined, we hope you will drop us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to us on. We also have some exciting events coming up later this month in July. The director of the U.S. AI Safety Institute, Elizabeth Kelly, will be here for a conversation with Greg, and we will also welcome the Chief Digital and AI Officer at the DoD, Dr. Radha Plum. You can check out the specific details of those events on the Wadhwani Center page at csis.org for more information. We'll catch you again in a couple of weeks, and thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for show notes and our research reports. This podcast was produced by David Lotfi, Isaac Goldston, Isabel Burns, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.